Sweyn Forkbeard was most famously known for being the first Viking king of England, way back in the year 1013. Sweyn was known as Forkbeard, on the account that his beard was in a similar shape of a fork, long and cleft. He was the son of the great Viking Harald Bluetooth, and was born sometime around 960. An interesting note is that Sweyn would be baptized upon birth, marking him as a Christian, much like his father was, having converted. This would serve to be quite ironic, considering Sweyn's actions later on in life, which we'll cover in a moment. He was known as being a brutal man, who, as you can imagine, lived in a rather brutal time. His most earliest achievement would be the slaying of his own father, the legendary Viking himself, Harald Bluetooth, in the year 986, making him just 26 years of age. After this encounter, Sweyn would become considerably more ambitious, and would find his attention drawn to England. By the early 990s, he would lead a campaign of destruction against England, bringing chaos and violence to many areas. The king at the time, Ethelred, or Ethelred the Unready as he was known, meaning ill-advised or no counsel, decided that engaging with Sweyn was unwise. He came up with a ruse to pay Sweyn to return to Denmark and leave England in peace, something like a self-established tax that would be known as Danegeld. But this strategy to pay Sweyn not to be a mass devourer of the land didn't exactly work, because the Danes continued raiding anyway, though on a smaller scale. Worse yet, some of them began to like England enough that they decided to settle there. Under pressure from his subjects, Ethelred was convinced that the Danes were a menace and that they should be vanquished from the land. On November 13th, 1002, a day that would become known as St. Brice's Day, it saw the mass extermination of many Danes living in England under the order of King Ethelred himself. Historians believe that there was indeed a tremendous loss of life on that day, though there is little evidence to prove just how many Danes were actually killed. It's understood that none were exempt from the butchering, including those who were innocent, such as women and children. Among those said to be killed, however, was a woman named Gunhild, the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, as well as her husband, Palig Tokuson, a Danish man who happened to be an alderman of Devonshire. Some argue, however, that Palig Tokuson brought on Gunhild's death himself by defecting from his post and joining the raiders to savage the south coast. Either way, Gunhild was dead, and Sweyn Forkbeard was not a happy man. Sweyn swore vengeance against Ethelred, and in the year 1003, he invaded England with full force. It's understood that England had not seen such a devastating force on this scale before, where Sweyn's men would go on to wreck and plunder much of the country without mercy. In fact, the devastation was so extreme that Ethelred had to open up his wallet again and would pay off the Danes once more. But the raids continued anyway, and Sweyn would return to England 10 years later, in the year 1013, landing in now what is modern-day Kent, on the east coast. He would rampage through the land, subduing the people there without much hassle. However, upon approaching London, he would find more of a challenge, though not nearly enough to cause him much worry. Ethelred and his ally, Thorkell the Tall, a Viking who he had made an ally out of, would hold against Sweyn and his force. But it wouldn't be long before the English morale took a plunge, and many of the people feared severe repercussions if they did not submit to Sweyn. They became so afraid that the English earls took it upon themselves to declare Sweyn their king, causing Ethelred to flee into exile. Sweyn was named king on Christmas Day, of all days, in the year 1013, but his reign would actually only last for just 5 weeks. He would die very suddenly in Gainsborough, Lincolnshire, on February the 3rd in the year 1014. His death has a mixture of accounts, which none have been confirmed. Some say that he fell from his horse and died from the injuries he received, whereas others say he was met with a stroke. A much more crazier legend states that the ghost of Saint Edmund, a former king of East Anglia who was infamously martyred by Danish forces years before, rose up from the grave and murdered Sweyn with a spear. Sweyn would leave a son behind after his death, one known as Canute, who would eventually become known as Canute the Great, who I'll be covering in a future video. Sweyn's body would be buried in England, his body later moved to Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark. Archaeologists have since discovered human remains at the cathedral, in the site of an old wooden church, built by none other than Sweyn's father, Harald Bluetooth. It's likely that these unidentified remains are indeed the bones of Sweyn Forkbeard himself. I hope you guys enjoyed our journey through Sweyn Forkbeard's life. Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button while you're there. Our next Viking was one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. Until the next time.